Well, thank you everybody for coming to this virtual artist talk and resurrecting Zoom school for today. I'm going to read a short bio and introduce our artist, Nina Katchadourian. Nina Katchadourian is an interdisciplinary artist whose work includes video, performance, sound, sculpture, photography, and public projects. She received a BA from Brown University and an MFA from the University of California, San Diego. She has shown at numerous locations, including Palais de Tokyo, Istanbul Museum of Modern Art, the Museum of Contemporary Art, San Diego, ICA Philadelphia, the Brooklyn Museum, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and MoMA PS1, among others. Her work is in public and private collections, including the Met, the Blanton Museum of Art, the Morgan Library, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Margulies Collection, and Saatchi Gallery. She lives and works in Brooklyn and Berlin and teaches at NYU Gallatin. She is represented by Catherine Clark Gallery and Pace Gallery. Nina creates work that is playful yet systematic, oftentimes questioning the human propensity to create systems of categorization. From mending spiders' webs, to creating an audio tour about the dust that gathers in museums, to making self-portraits in the Flemish style in airplane lavatories, Nina's work is subtle and witty, subversive and intelligent, humorous and succinct, all at the same time. Please join me in welcoming our visiting artist, Nina Katchadourian.
Thank you. While you were doing that, Dylan, thank you, which I always find it really weird to hear myself described. I was scrolling through to see who was on the Zoom, and I recognize many of you. So hi, and thanks for coming. And I wish I could be there in person. And I think that of late, I've sort of veered more towards doing artist talks that just look at a few things in slightly more depth than kind of trying to do the, and then I did this, and then I did that, and then I did this. So I'm happy to talk about if there are questions after and there are things that you wanted me to address that you might be aware of that I never talked about. I'm happy to talk about work that I'm not showing today. But I really wanted to kind of organize this around, I suppose you could say, methodology, really, more than anything else. And some of these questions, some of these things I'll show you are photographic in nature, but I think that it's sort of maybe more useful for me to orient this around questions that preoccupy me right now. And some of them ethical ones that I understand from Dylan have sort of been preoccupying many of you as well. So there'll be sort of another kind of bridge there. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen. And so, yeah, that's right. This is what they call a destination check. Like if this is not the Zoom you mean to be attending, then you're on the wrong one. Okay, sorry. Now I'm having it. Oh, there we go. Okay. This should work. All right. So I think these days a great deal about this. Or I have been, I've been thinking about this question for a really long time in a variety of different ways. What can you do with what's already there? Some of that directs me often towards the, as I like to say, the dumb stuff that surrounds us all the time. You know, words that sort of words that describe that often in sort of more art speak might be the mundane, the everyday, things like that. But I really try, I think, in overarching terms, to often just come at what is around me all the time anyway, with a spirit of optimism and perhaps curiosity, to try to kind of turn over those things that are often overlooked and to try to sort of ask myself, like, what else might there be here? A value of worthy of consideration. What might I be also in a way not taking seriously enough when it comes to my curiosity about why something is the way it is in the everyday that surrounds me. So that's a kind of broad statement, and it gets applied in a lot of different ways. But I think it is sort of ultimately the most consistent question I've had through my many years of making art. Maybe I'll also throw in that I never meant to be an artist. This really wasn't the plan. The plan was to be a radio journalist. That's what I grew up really wanting to do. And part of that was the interest in working with sound. Part of it is my longstanding engagement with music and making music, which is sort of a much more background and less public practice for me, but that's been around longer than making art has been for me, in fact. I was doing a lot of radio in high school, and I loved working with my voice. I loved editing sound. And then I got to college and sort of discovered that there were all kinds of different ways of making art. I thought making art was like drawing and painting, and that was sort of it. And then eventually I realized artist was in fact the best umbrella term I had ever come across that would allow me to do everything I wanted to do. So that was kind of the neat trick, I thought, to find a job description that could be so capacious and all-encompassing. And that really is kind of the spirit in which I think I've been an artist since I've been an artist. All right, so I wanted to just start with a project that I started unintentionally in 2010, and which, although I have ongoing in the slide, I think I might officially say for the first time, I think this project is now done. I think I've sort of reached the end of its trajectory, and it might be sort of finished at this point. And I do often start things not knowing whether it will be a one-time event or something ongoing. In this case, it went on for a pretty long time. And it began with a very spontaneous event of, or question to myself that I posed while sitting on a plane in 2010, flying from New York to Atlanta, about 2.5 hours long flight. And I sort of looked around me and thought, what is it about this situation where once again, this sort of time spent on a plane in transit is time that doesn't really count. Already from the outset, I've sort of decided to discount it, to think of it as valueless, as not possibly worthy of holding anybody's interest, including mine, and certainly not a sort of potential space for art making. And I thought, that's terrible, given the things I often say about wanting to be optimistic about the everyday and all of that stuff I just said to you. That's a terrible attitude. And why not actually challenge myself to here too, think of this as possibly an opportunity. So I gave myself that task. I just said, I'll make stuff the whole way to Atlanta, whatever that's going to mean, that's what I'm going to do on this flight. And what I had to work with was whatever surrounded me and my cell phone. And I set to work. And although I wouldn't say anything that happened on that first flight was brilliant, there were enough things that happened that I looked at these pictures later on my phone and thought, I kind of need to keep doing this and sort of see where it will go. And then now 12 years later, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of photos that are part of this project, and not just photos, but actually also video performances, sound works. And it's become a kind of vast archive of images, and also images selected out from this kind of image bank, and that print as photographs and show that way. So I'm just going to show you a smattering of them, so you can kind of understand how they work. This is called Pretzel Landslide. It is an extremely small situation in real life, probably 2 by 3 inches, maybe a little bigger, but a picture from the in-flight magazine that I crumbled up the snacks that were passed out to us by the flight attendants, crumbled up the pretzels and poured them onto the page. I think this is a picture of the Blue Ridge Parkway, sort of winding through a beautiful fall landscape in the Blue Ridge Mountains. So a small thing becomes vast, and there's a kind of small scale disaster of sorts happening here. Pretzels are very useful building materials. I've used them a bunch of times. This is called Pretzel Meteor, which I think of as sort of a science fiction scene almost of, meteor hits the earth and this car just barely gets away. And you'll notice that at the back top edge of the image, you can see the curve of the magazine page, which is something I do often intentionally to kind of simultaneously undermine the illusionism that is really often a tactic of this project. I want there to be a moment where you can sort of figure out exactly what's happening at the same time as you might also buy into the illusion of what might be quite convincingly something else. So sort of the situation of having kind of a foot in each place is something I've been thinking about a lot lately too. This was a dance review in the New York Times, I remember, and I, again, using snacks passed out to us, created this kind of gravity on the arms of these 2 dancers. That was a group of green peas that I was snacking on a return trip once from Europe back to New York, placed on an in-flight magazine image of Lake Como. That is from a sort of sub-series of the project that I call Proposals for Public Sculpture. And that's, as you can see, a lemon wedge that was in the drink that I had. And it happens to be on a baseball field in Chicago. But I was thinking of that kind of large scale, bombastic public sculpture that, at least in New York City, often stands in front of things like bank buildings, and which sort of signals, we have large art in front of our building. That's often, I think, the way some of those sculptures work. So this is sort of a way of reminding me to also say that within the larger project that is Seed Assignment, I have these sub-series where I've kind of, extracted images that kind of hang together as a group. There's a lot of sort of taxonomizing of the bigger project, and this is one of them, Proposals for Public Sculpture. This is another one that's called High Altitude Spirit Photography, where I'm actually adding nothing to this image. I am angling a shiny magazine page to try to catch the light from overhead, and in doing so, dematerialize the person or something in the image. But I'm really not placing anything on the image. I'm sort of, in a way, exploiting the problem or the particular way that the camera sees. Not unlike some of the ways that spirit photography worked. This was the result of one sitting in a window seat and holding up the magazine page to the bright light that was coming in through the window, and noticing when I did that the image on the front and the image on the back of the page would merge. And I had this kind of accidental and sometimes interesting collision of two things. Long after this, I learned that Robert Heineken has also made pictures like this, and I didn't know this when I started these, but these are completely, in that sense, unmanipulated. I just sort of end up searching for things, and maybe they're there in an issue and maybe they're not, but it's a really enjoyable kind of treasure hunt for me to go looking for these. And I end up sort of sitting there and reading the magazine sideways, perhaps a little mysteriously for the person next to me. This is called American Pain, which I feel a lot of these days. And it's a back clinic ad on one side and an ad for American Airlines on the other. This is a sweater gorilla, which you can see is a sweater in my lap that I've shaped to look like a gorilla face. And it's important to point out that this really only looks like this to me, sitting here looking through my phone at it. I get a lot of questions with this project about, what does the person next to you say, or what do they ask you? And the answer is, it's happened very rarely that anyone has asked me what I'm doing. They can't see this. This just looks like a lady playing with her sweater, I think, to the person next to me. But people are generally trying, I can never quite figure it out. They might be trying to ignore me because the activities look odd. Or they perhaps, just as we often do on planes, have this kind of attitude that, this is my space, the space I have paid for, my seat, and anything that's going on external to that is either none of my business or none of my concern, or I just don't want to know. So I rarely ever have, I think 3 times, I could even tell you each of the 3 instances that someone has spoken to me and asked me what I'm up to. And the other thing, of course, is that I'm using my phone. So the very thing I'm trying to not be, which is a disengaged bored person, is my cover. It's my alibi. That is what I look like. I look like a bored person playing with her phone. And that kind of helps me get away with this in a way. I definitely don't want it to look like I'm making art, which is, among many reasons, a reason why I've committed to my cell phone camera as opposed to, bringing a better camera. As time goes on, cell phone cameras get more and more remarkable. So the project really isn't suffering technically from that choice, and hasn't been for years, actually. That's the guy next to me who didn't know I took this picture, and I'm taking it in the seatbelt buckle. It's reflected, it's sort of, used like a spy camera. There are ways in which this project grows kind of gently intrusive upon the people sitting around me. I guess that's an ethical question. I sort of feel like he's so unrecognizable that it doesn't pose a problem, but there is kind of a nervous moment for me always when I make these, wondering if I will get caught. And so far I have not. I like to puncture the page with my finger. Fingers are very odd out of context of the hand, I think. I don't know, I can't find words for this always easily, but it's like they become a kind of separate thing very quickly, the way that toes do also, or very, very long hair does. Sort of like it leaves the body and becomes an entity of its own. So there's also something here about just breaking that illusion again that I like. So this is a very friendly finger. This is a tired finger. And that's a sick finger on an operating table. I made this image about 2 weeks before the 10-year anniversary of 9/11, and had been on a flight eating these little cookies that I brought along called Manor wafers, and which I love, these cheap cookies. And I just kind of spontaneously stood 2 of them up on my tray table and looked down on them, and then kind of realized what it was this was reminding me of. So there's sort of there was this odd sort of, I did it before I really, it kind of revealed itself to me in a way that I hadn't seen coming. But it does make me think about something that I think has pervasively been part of this project, which, although there is a lot of play and humor in it, I think is also about the anxiety of air travel that for me crept in after 9/11 in a very different way. A kind of suspicion that began between passengers, you know, a kind of, if you see something, say something-ness to a lot of what it has meant to move around on airplanes. And this image very much tries to think about that. I was reading a magazine on my lap, opened it up, and this ad appeared, which I think is pretty weird on its own terms already. And I decided to try to sort of put a face into this void of a face. And I did that by tearing through the page with my fingernail. And the face that, you know, somewhat out of control of that rendering as I was, the face that emerged was this kind of odd face, one part kind of comical and perhaps also menacing, strange, creaturely, kind of like a stingray, I thought. But then it had a kind of interaction with that safety on board card that changed it all again. And I thought there was something going on here that was interesting to me. Obviously, I'm thinking about things like racial profiling and other things that happen on airplanes that we have no end of examples to think about. So I was on a very, well, actually the first time, okay, so I was on a domestic flight, I think from New York to San Francisco. And I went into the bathroom to use the bathroom and thought, okay, well, I haven't done anything in a bathroom before. And, you know, same rules apply. I'm only going to work with what I find and only use my phone. So what do I have in here? And I took one of those tissue paper seat covers out of the holder and scrunched it up and sort of made this headdress thing, took the picture with phone extended in one arm and went back to my seat and looked at this and thought, that's odd. Why did I just make this image? It sort of, you know, reminds me of a certain period of 15th century Flemish, early Flemish painting that I've always loved. Kind of reminds me of a Memling. I've never made a painting. Painting is utterly mysterious to me. I love looking at painting, but I do not know it at all as a maker. And there might, I think, have been something kind of thrilling about having kind of made a painting by making this image. And I thought, okay, I need to make some more of these. And I have a good opportunity coming up because I had 6 months later a very, very, very long flight to New Zealand for a residency and an exhibition that was going to happen there. And in fact, to turn the screws on myself a little further, I decided I would propose to the museum that I would make my entire exhibition on the flight on the way there, to really press the question, what can I do when I am under these sort of constraints? I mean, this whole project is really oriented around all kinds of layers of constraint, of time, of material, of imagination, of fatigue, pressure. We could think about pressure, air pressure even. So I don't know. I just set myself the challenge. They bravely, I think, said yes to that exhibition proposal, and I set to work. And one of the things I had the chance to do on this very long flight was make a lot more images in the bathroom because no one was ever using it. There was never a line on this 20 whatever hour flight, endlessly long from New York to Dunedin, New Zealand. Anyway, I think as before, you can see very easily what the materials are that I'm using. And at the same time, people seem to react to these in a way that I think to me indicates that they are kind of ghosted by these actual paintings out there in museums like the Met or the National Portrait Gallery in London. of paintings that they've seen where there is this kind of attitude or this kind of temperament of the sitter involved. So they're all taken hand outstretched. And these have had a curious and sort of viral life online a few times now. They sort of in a way ran away from the rest of the project and had their own life out there, which on one hand has been sort of wonderful. And on the other hand is sort of a problem. I have a lot to say about the way that art and the internet sometimes meet up with one another. And I think a kind of problem I have had with this series is that people have a little too often taken them up as a kind of prank, which is really not my intention. And I think out of context of the rest of the project, it can be a bit troublesome to kind of not understand what really motivated these within the bigger set of questions that motivates all of it. So the last few years, I've spent a lot of time trying to kind of rope these back in and get them back into the context of the other many, many, many images. Yeah, there's a lot to say about humor, maybe in the Q&A, if anyone's interested in that, I can address that more. So Dylan mentioned this project briefly in the introduction, but I thought I would speak to you a bit about it today. I was invited by MoMA to come and do, sort of engage with them via their education department and a project that they have, a program that they have called Artists Experiment. It is really interesting to come into a museum, any museum, via the education department. I've done it a couple times, and it's a very different kind of culture in the education department, a very different mandate too, but often a lot more flexibility and a kind of pressure that is not there, that sometimes when you come in via the curatorial channels are much more there. And with MoMA, it was really interesting, like the kind of reputation of that institution and its history, et cetera, like definitely put a kind of self-consciousness onto what could and couldn't happen there. So I went in without any particular idea. My only task, as described by them, was to make something that would engage the public, which is pretty much just about anything. So I just felt, first and foremost, okay, I just kind of got given this like green, free pass to this place. Like I can kind of talk to anyone here and go anywhere here behind the scenes. Like, what do I want to learn about this place? I've always found it intimidating as an artist to go there. It's fascinating, intimidating, hallowed, and impenetrable, maybe 4 words that might come to mind. So my first question was really, who's in here? Who's in this building? What do they do? Who are the people you never get to meet when you visit this museum as a person there to see an exhibition? And I spent about 6 months, I think, just walking through the museum with different people who had different kinds of jobs there, doing things that were really crucial to the museum's functioning. That meant walking through with, for example, the head of security. We saw the entire Robert Gober show with her pointing out to me where the guards were placed and why, where the cameras were placed and why. It was totally fascinating. I went through with the head of facilities and maintenance, who talked about air ducts and air conditioning and heating and cooling and MoMA's kind of constant temperature that it always needs to be at, and all the backup power systems in case there's a power outage that would keep the museum going for several days on a generator. On and on and on and on and on. And because I was at the museum so much, I was also visiting parts of the museum I didn't always have time to go to. And that included a gallery on one of the upper floors that overlooked that giant atrium at MoMA. And there was a big pane of glass separating this gallery from the atrium space outside. And it was not a pane of glass you could open. It was not a window in that sense. But in one of those funny architecture moments of not thinking about the practical life of a building, perhaps, the exterior of this window was a ledge that used to get unbelievably dusty because you couldn't get up there to clean it ever. It was extremely inaccessible. There it is. And as I was visiting the museum, this ledge would sort of just get, depending on how you want to look at it, either better and better or worse and worse. I thought it was better and better and dustier and dustier, certainly. And I don't know, I kept going back to it. I kept feeling like there's something interesting happening here. Dust is not supposed to be in museums and should not settle on modernism or something like that. And it just struck me as such a curiosity. And at some point then, these things of dust had something to do with one another and could in fact sort of be brought together via this hub subject of dust. So I proposed to MoMA I would make a project about dust in the museum, and it would take the form of an audio tour. This was kind of me wanting to be a radio journalist, I think, again, rearing its head. This is a picture of that ledge with Pete and Hector going up to clean it and collecting the dust for me, which I got as a souvenir at the end. Once I had sort of located the subject and sort of project trajectory for myself, I then went back and talked to all those people I had spoken to before again, and this time recorded it, interviewed them, and asked many more specific questions. Conservation is, of course, always, I think, a fascinating set of people to talk to in museums. But of course, at MoMA, they had a lot of things they did behind the scenes and before the museum opened. For example, there was a whole sort of dusting routine that took place for some of the particular problem spots. This was what used to be called the Brancusi platform, where they had 10 Brancusi sculptures, and that white big platform area was constantly filling with dust. So these moments became really interesting to me. I mean, she's essentially, in her socks as if she was at home, kind of dusting something at home, and yet it's this famous sculpture. We put some dust under the conservation microscope one day. I asked them if they had ever done that, and they said, no, why would we? And I asked if we could, and what revealed itself was actually this incredibly colorful material. It was somehow so exciting to see all this color. And that's because what dust really is bits and pieces of us, humans, our clothing, our hair, bits of our skin. And dust is also stuff from the outside world, the grime and grit of the city, pollution, and matter from far outside of the earth, stuff that literally kind of gets here from space. So it has a combination of, the low and the high, the celestial and the mundane that I like. And that also made it a good subject, I think, or interesting one for me to delve into. You may remember that there is this helicopter that hangs in one of the stairwells. This is a total dust nightmare spot for MoMA. They cannot get up there to clean it often or easily. And Nelson Nieves, who was one of my favorite people to talk to at MoMA, was in the facilities and maintenance end of things. It really, really bothered him, like on a sort of personal level, it bothered him when the helicopter got dusty. And he's not allowed to clean it because that has to be done by the conservation department. So there are all these interesting ways in which people are sort of siloed. But I'm gonna let you hear one of these soundtracks so you can kind of get a sense of how the audio tour worked. So imagine that you have your phone or the MoMA audio tour device in your hand, and you have scanned the QR code on the wall at this site, and then you would hear the following soundtrack.
This is a Bell 47 D1 helicopter from 1945. It's in MoMA's design collection, and it's one of the most difficult objects to dust in the entire museum. A lot of different people are alert to the dust that gathers on the helicopter. Here's Nelson Nieves from Building Operations.
If you look up towards the right-hand side of the black wall at the cable, where the cable is joining into the wall, you'll notice that there's a large amount of dust. And the blades, you'll see the top of this blade is virtually impossible to get to. On the cabling itself, see the amount of dust that's on that cable. And it kills me because I can't get to it. It's sitting there and it's taunting me and laughing at me, and I can't get to it. Drives me crazy.
The dusting of the helicopter happens about 4 times a year. I got to watch very early one morning as 2 conservators went up in a huge lift to get within inches of the helicopter. Then they got out what looked like giant Q-tips and carefully wiped down the blades. The Q-tips were actually long extension poles with woolly tips. After he got off the lift, I talked to conservator Roger Griffith and asked him what he had been using up there.
We've done a lot of tests on dusting in general, what captures the dust and what doesn't. Wool dusters actually has little hooks on it and it grabs the dust.
I also noticed they wiped the cockpit with some kind of special cloth, so I asked about that too.
They're aerospace grade wipes.
Wow.
And they're a fiberless kind of cloth.
Yeah.
I think it's non-woven, and it doesn't leave any of the fiber behind. And they were actually designed for the air and space industry.
Oh my God.
So they wouldn't scratch.
Objects in a museum often jump categories in such curious ways. This helicopter was used for surveillance, as an aerial ambulance during the Korean War, and for crop dusting. But now it's getting dusted, wiped with special cloths and caressed by wool dusters wielded by careful humans on giant lifts. It's as if it's retired to a very high-end spa.
Okay, I'm going to switch gears now. So then the pandemic happened, and we're all sick of talking about that. But I'm going to talk about it a little bit because it did for me kind of change the parameters of my art making, and perhaps my attention kind of shifted to other things too, in ways that had a lot to do with being at home a lot, thinking about a kind of isolation and maroonedness that we all suddenly were experiencing, I think, in different ways. But initially, I found it really impossible to make anything. And, to the point of it becoming irritating, I think people were often saying things like, wow, it must be a great time to be an artist. It's like all this time and it must be fantastic. And it's like, no, it's not fantastic. It's a pandemic. It sucks. It's horrible for everybody. But I had sort of found that I was taking a lot of comfort in making things, like very manually making things. And I decided to sort of think about that term art making in two halves, and to push aside the pressures of what it might be to make art, and instead just really give myself a lot of permission and leeway to just make things that made me feel good to make. And one of the things that felt really good to make were fake plants. I just made a bunch of plants for the house, for my apartment. And this was all happening in Berlin, without any intention of this being something that I would even share with anyone or show or anything like that. But the first plant I made was a cactus. I was missing California, where I grew up, missing the desert. And I made a cactus out of a lot of used cardboard boxes and toothpicks. And I'll just play you a video which kind of moves you up the thing from the floor to its tippy tips. There were about 600 painted toothpicks on the outside of this thing. And I was looking at images of particular cacti, trying to kind of understand their structure, their form, their architecture. And then just the repetitiveness of this activity, the sort of deeply handmade, wonky nature of this imperfect object, all of that it hit the spot, is what I would say about it. It just felt like exactly the nicest place to be mentally that I could find. So I kind of continued doing this, and then made a whole bunch. And spontaneously then on a video call about something else entirely with my gallery, I showed them one of these, and they said, wow, let's do a show of fake plants. And I thought I hadn't really been doing it with that intention, but thought about it for a while. I said, can I think about that for a few days? Thought about it for a few days and realized that in fact, although I thought this had nothing to do with art that I'd made before, it did in fact have a lot to do with a whole long-standing engagement I've had with making things that kind of try to think about the human place vis-a-vis non-human animals, the natural world, what we think of as the natural world, the fake, the artificial, the natural, all kinds of things like that. And these actually sort of fit in perfectly with a show that I then proposed that would sort of join up some of these older projects and older works with these newer plants. So this became a show. It went to Pace Gallery's space in Hong Kong. In November, I wasn't able to go myself. It was a 3-week quarantine and too far away. I was teaching that semester. But I'm just going to show you a few. I think I made about 40 plants for that show, and I'll just show you a few. But again, very, very much made of only stuff that was already around me in this way. This project has a lot to do with seed assignment. This is a box of frozen beans, cardboard that I just cut apart, glued portions of that cardboard to these red, or it's like a kind of wire covered with paper that I then tinted red, some sort of fern. There's a similar fern made of a blueberry box. This is a surgical mask. I don't even need to tell you why there are so many masks that came into this project, but there are lots. And actually N95 masks have a very beautiful structure when you cut them apart. This one is made of N95 mask material. They sort of separate. A lot of the plants grow out of salt, which I think was sort of an oblique environmental crisis rumination for me. So you can recognize again a lot of household materials. I was sort of, rummaging through drawers and often literally going through my trash or the trash of the studio or the trash of the construction site outside, just trying to haul in stuff and again, kind of turn it over and see what it could do. The flowers of this plant are made from styrofoam, which only certain types of styrofoam seem to have the structure, but if you pick it apart, this certain type, you can kind of find these clusters within it that already have a kind of flower-like structure. So I was sort of digging through styrofoam to extract these flowers. There's a tennis ball in the middle of that one that I had lying around, kitchen sponge, monofilament, styrofoam balls. I was thinking about these little ecosystems that already exist in our homes where, mold grows or there are spores or sort of these things we often find kind of disgusting, but I think they're kind of interesting, actually. So there were a lot. Spaghetti. This one was very fragile. This one was even more fragile, also made of spaghetti. So I guess I'm trying to also find a very refined kind of quality to these junky things. It was also about them kind of switching categories that way. That's the biggest one I made. That's about 5 feet tall and starts with a packing tube core. Then it goes to poster tubes. Then it goes to toilet paper tubes, of which I hoarded many during the pandemic. And then the flowers are ping pong balls wrapped in this crepe paper and magenta felt leaves with hand colored sewing pins sort of sticking out of the tips of them. Okay, so that happened. And then the other thing that happened, actually this happened before the plants, but I kind of wanted to end with this project. So I'll speak to this as the last thing, and then we can maybe have a conversation. There's a long backstory to this. I think for me, there are projects that I have some things happen very spontaneously, as you've seen. Other things I've had in my head for a very, very long time, and I just don't know what I'm going to do about them for a very long time. They kind of rattle around in there, and there may be many false starts, as there has been with this one, or there have been maybe sort of a feeling that like, I'm trying to make this thing, but the time doesn't feel right. It isn't time yet. And I think with this project, I really learned that, suddenly it's the right time for reasons I can get into. So this is the first show I had during the pandemic, and I worked on it really for most of that first pandemic year, starting in the summer, and then it was exhibited for the first time in January 2021. So the backstory kind of goes like this. My family was living in England when I was 7 years old for a year. My dad had a sabbatical and we went there. And my mother read aloud this book to me. It was a bestseller at the time, written by a guy named Dougal Robertson. He was the father of a family that had decided to sell their farm in Northern England. They were not wealthy. They were a pretty poor farming family. They sold everything they had in order to buy a sailboat and sail around the world for 4 years. And the goal was to sort of teach the kids who had only ever grown up on this farm, only knowing what was on the farm, to sort of experience the bigger place that was the world and all the different people in it. So they set out on this voyage. They are about a year into their trip, with, by the way, nobody but the father having any sailing experience previous to this trip. They have come through the Panama Canal. They've gone to the Galapagos Islands, and about 200 miles west of the Galapagos, a pod of killer whales comes along, and these orcas smash the sailboat and they sink. The sailboat sinks. The orcas probably thought the sailboat was another whale, and it was not purposefully mean in that way. The Robertsons were then set adrift for 38 days in a rubber raft. And then about 17 days into the period of being adrift, the rubber raft literally sinks from underneath them. It is so full of holes. They have to get into a much, much smaller fiberglass dinghy that they are towing behind them, and are eventually rescued by a Japanese fishing boat that crosses their path and sees them. They were pretty well on the way to making it to the coast of probably Costa Rica, is where they would have eventually gotten to land. Whether they would have been able to actually get on land in their weakened state is a whole other question, but it's a story that has totally possessed me since I was a kid. And I've reread and reread and reread this book, I mean, more times than I can count. I'd say really, without exaggeration, probably once a year. I read this book, and I've always wanted to make something about it. I just didn't know what it would be. I also read a book by the oldest son in the family, Douglas. So there's Dougal, the father, and Douglas, the son. Douglas, the son, was 18 years old when this ordeal happened to his family. And in 2005, he wrote a book, which is sort of his account of the shipwreck and the period adrift, which differs in some really interesting and different, important ways from his father's account. By the way, if it's not clear, the picture on the left is on the cover of that book is the moment of their rescue. And you can just see a little bit of how small this dinghy was with 6 people in it. So I decided that the time had come to do something I'd been wanting to do for a very long time. And that was to actually reach out to Douglas, the son, who's now 66 years old and living in London. He had become an accountant, and ask him if I could speak to him about his family's, I don't want to call it an adventure, although it was that to me at that time before I started the project. Ordeal, maybe is a good word, experience. I reached him. I ended up writing, I found an email online. I ended up writing a long letter to him, trying not to sound too crazy. I was so obsessed with the story. I sort of didn't want that to put him off. I was trying to find the right balance of sounding engaged and informed, but not bonkers, and asked him if he might be willing to be in touch with me. And he wrote back immediately and said, yeah, absolutely. Here's my phone number. Give me a call. Very casual. We got on the phone. We talked for an hour. And I think it became quite clear to him I wasn't the average journalist who he's been interviewed many, many times about this. But I wasn't asking the sort of typical questions. And at the end of the call, I said, Douglas, my plan is this summer that I want to do a project where every day, tracking the days that you guys were shipwrecked from June 15th to July 22nd, I'm going to make a project about that. And every day in some way that I'm not really sure what I'll do, I'm going to sort of do something to follow the events of that day. And would you be willing to maybe speak to me a few times during this 38-day period? And he said, pretty much without missing a beat, well, we really should speak every day, which was, the thing I was just dying to ask him and just thought was totally unreasonable to ask a perfect stranger. But he said it, and he used the pronoun we, which made me really happy. And I decided that, this really was my heart's desire, and I took him up on it. And this is what we did. We talked every day for 38 days. I would start my day in my studio by reading that day's chapter in his father's book, and then in Douglas's book, underlining everything that was different, the discrepancies between them. So I had questions to ask him when we met up on the phone. The entire thing happened as a phone call. I did not want to do it on video. I wanted us to have the sort of privacy, you could say, the protection of just a voice encounter. And I think in some way it made us feel actually further away from one another, which seemed important, both in terms of what the pandemic was feeling like, but also what it is to be shipwrecked, and thinking about distance in that sense too. One of the things that became important to me as we made our way through this was to sort of try to materialize and really understand the nature of what they were encountering and the scale often of what they were encountering. So one of the first things I did was to make a giant paper orca to scale. You can see my studio then was very small, and I projected in sections this orca on the wall, and then found ways to kind of make this giant whale. And then I mailed it to him. So he received this thing, opened it up in his garden in London, and took this, I love this photograph with his wife trying to kind of hide behind the tail and not be visible. And he said something very interesting to me upon receiving this. He said, that little patch of gray on the whale's back, when I unpacked the orca and I saw that, a shiver went down my spine, because I had forgotten what it was like to be in the water with a whole bunch of them. There were like 20, he said, in this pod. And we thought we were going to be eaten. We thought this was really the end. We thought they were going to eat us and destroy us the way they had destroyed our sailboat. So there was sort of something about this prop, you could say, like bringing something back in his memory too. And I did this a number of times. All of these objects end up sort of in the exhibition eventually. And you can see it's been folded up and shipped all over the place by now a couple times around the world. I also sent him a couple of sea turtles one day, because sea turtles were largely what they subsisted on. And I wanted to know if I had the scale right, if I had the right species. You know, Douglas, do you remember the turtles being brown, or do you remember them being green? Like, in the meantime, I'm writing to all these turtle experts in Costa Rica to figure out what the likely species would be that they were encountering out there. So there was a kind of natural history research going on alongside all this. And Douglas is a big texter. So, you know, he would text me back. I love these two pictures. He's sitting in his garden on like a chair from the living room. This is how we hauled them aboard. And then further instructions. If you caught the rear flipper, you couldn't hang on. Mostly we caught the brown ones though. And then, you know, further tips for how to catch sea turtles. So back and forth we went, and these text message exchanges are also part of what I exhibit. They had very few tools. I think there is part of my obsession with the story is the unbelievable resourcefulness that they show in the face of, I mean, what can one say? In the face of doom, really, it seems that there's no way to survive an experience like this. They invent tools, they fix tools that they have that are broken. They have basically two knives. One of them is totally useless, this raft knife with this weird curve that's supposed to prevent you from puncturing the raft, but it doesn't cut anything, he said. And then a turtle knife that was a kitchen knife they happened to grab from the sailboat before it sank, and which they have to do all of their butchering with. Yeah, it's incredible that thing held up at all. I sent Douglas a couple of sharks, because once by accident they catch a shark, and once on purpose they catch a shark and kill and eat it. And here he takes the sharks spontaneously into his bedroom and takes a picture of him with them. And so there was a way I really loved how the sort of his safe domestic environment now kind of meets this incredibly dangerous thing that was happening then. I had already made an important pilgrimage in, when was it now, 2011, to a museum in the south of England in Cornwall, to see the artifacts from the Robertsons' experience. The dinghy survived the trip, and so did a lot of the things that were in the dinghy. You're looking here at a bottle of turtle oil. It's kept in a rum bottle that they had lying around. And I'll explain why turtle oil is important, but this is a shark tooth from one of those sharks that they caught. Turtle oil turned out to be a sort of panacea for them. It was very good on saltwater boils that they developed, so it sort of helped protect their skin. It also became very important in the process of delivering to themselves enemas, using this homemade, very homemade enema device made of a piece of tubing from the raft and a plastic bag. And Lynn, the mother of this family, who had trained as a nurse, had this brilliant idea, which is that not salt water, but rainwater that was too contaminated to drink could possibly be absorbed through the body the other way in. So Douglas laughed as he told me. He said, you should have seen the awkward operation that delivering these enemas was, but we all met it with good humor, and it arguably really saved their lives. So that's the enema device in the museum on the left, and on the right is the replica that I made. And there are many of these sorts of replicas throughout the exhibition. This is a dorado, also called a dolphin fish, also called a mahi-mahi. You may have eaten one. And they were the fish that the Robertsons encountered most frequently. They are very, very fast. They can be very, very big, and they're very hard to catch. And again, a beautiful, incredible invention. This gaff that Dougal, the father, managed to make, that it's not a spear, it's something you basically hook the fish with and sort of sweep it into your boat with. And you have to do it with a kind of lightning quick, perfect timing, or it doesn't work. They chopped off a piece of the center thwart of the boat to make the handle of that. When I saw this dinghy in the museum, which was, by the way, like laying hands on a holy object for me, I noticed there was a piece of wood missing, and I sort of suspected it had been to make the spear, but speaking to Douglas, I finally got to ask him that question, and he confirmed that that was the case. And then my everyday began getting sort of affected by these things that were happening in our conversations. So I would be doing laundry, but I would hold a laundry pod and think, God, maybe this is sort of what a Dorado eyeball is like. And they used to suck on Dorado eyeballs for the water content that they held. And I would text him and sort of ask him about that. I made a lot of wire sculptures. These are a family of Dorado. There are a bunch of flying fish in there too, again, as a way of sort of trying to understand these animals. These are literally like wireframe, like analog wireframes of them. They kind of, there's a turtle too, they kind of fly around, flying fish. And then, you know, the exhibition really, maybe I can show you that shot, is an encounter for the viewer of a 38-day long story, the same way that my experience of reading the book was, and the same way that my conversation with Douglas was. It sort of occurred to me, I just need to follow the same structure. I want to sort of bring people along through the story the same way that I was brought through it. So there is a lot of audio to listen to. He and I recorded, I mean, I'd say our conversations became about 50 hours worth of audio in the end, which I edited down to about an hour and a half of short excerpts that you listen to, some of, perhaps all of, perhaps not, it doesn't matter. You sort of browse them as you, guided by your own interests. And in that way, you make your way through this whole story. The animals are hung on the days when they caught those animals. So flying fish, Dorado turtles, sharks, and then a lot of other things that happen along the way. There's not time now to kind of take you through all of it. On the floor of the second gallery here, I painted a to scale footprint of the dinghy so that you could sort of understand how small this boat was. This is how all of them fit themselves into first the raft at the top and then the dinghy at the bottom. There wasn't even enough room in the dinghy for them all to be lying down, and not at the same time. I made a tiny dinghy that I sent to Douglas so he could sort of weigh in on its shape. And this is the dinghy. This is the dinghy as I saw it in 2011 in the museum in Cornwall, which just, I still feel amazed when I look at this, how small it is, how it held up, how they all fit into it. And when they were all in it, there was 6 inches of it above the waterline. That's how low it was riding. And you have to imagine, you know, storms in the Pacific Ocean and sharks around them and stuff like that. This was a few years ago. The BBC did a story about this. That's Douglas in the red sweater to the right, and one of his brothers, Sandy, to the far left. And in the middle, a guy named Robin Williams, who was the lucky passenger who they were kind of giving him a ride across the Pacific Ocean, and he was on the Lucette on the sailboat when it sank. So they had one person there who was not a family member, and I interviewed him too. He had a lot of remarkable things to say, what it was like to sort of be the outsider. And this was a sort of press recreation of them in the dinghy a year after they were rescued on the occasion of the publication of Survive the Savage Sea. And that's me lying in the dinghy, just to sort of show you again the size of it. So I want to play you 2 sound clips. We have time just for these 2, and then I'm going to stop talking. There is a lot to say about how this conversation unfolded between us. And this is sort of, I guess, where I want to take up this ethical question of what it means to work with someone else's story. It was a huge concern for me, how to do that. And I guess one concern was sort of an artistic concern, that I don't like that kind of lazy art where you find something that's just so amazing in its own right that then you just sort of say, hey, look at this thing, and that's the piece. Like, I don't like it. I think there has to be more to it than that. And the question for me was sort of, what am I adding to this story? What am I doing that makes it sort of okay to work with it? Okay in both an artistic and an ethical sense too. Of course, I have my own relationship to the story as someone who read and reread the book. Like, that was sort of one thing I felt was important, was to sort of speak to what happened to the Robertsons, but then also what it means to have a kind of long-standing, ongoing, kind of obsessive relationship with a narrative that is someone else's. And then I think what was very important was that our conversation changed over time. It went from something that initially was perhaps resembled the way a journalist might speak to a subject that they're interviewing, sort of in that sense, more of a one-way, one person asks questions and the other person answers them, to something that I would really describe as a dialogue, where we got to know one another, we learned to trust one another. He exhibited, I mean, you know, will be thankful my whole life for the trust he put in me to tell the story the way he told it. He shared things with me that it was very clear I could not and would never put in the piece, things that would have been totally out of bounds to share outside the sort of family's experience, which I kept, obviously, sort of entrusted with that, would never, never, never trespass on that trust. And he started asking me questions also about me, about my family. I have genocide survivors in my family. We talked about the sort of meaning of survival in that context. And we traded stories. It became a conversation where we both sort of ended up meeting somewhere quite different than where we began. So the we that kind of began the project was one kind of we, and I'd say we sort of ended as a we in a somewhat different place. And I hope, if I've done it right, that my show ended up being something that that kind of spoke to what it means to listen to someone carefully and to listen to someone ethically, I guess I'll say. And I spent a lot of time thinking about what that was and how to do that and trying to do that. So I'm going to play you a day, an excerpt from a day that was a very, very emotional day for him. They had been without water for a few days, or running very low. It was terrifying. It was actually sort of one of the most physically painful things they went through was thirst. And this is the day when it finally rains. So this is day 35. They're 3 days from being rescued. They obviously don't know that. And they're on the brink of death because they don't have water. And this is Douglas doing a combination here of sort of reading aloud from the book, which was always very uncanny for me. This person in the book is now reading the book to me, and then sort of interjecting with other comments. So here goes.
The early hours of the pre-dawn morning saw us watching in an expectant hush as extensive banks of dark thundercloud massed in the southern sky, impenetrable grey with tattered black bases. The solid ballooning edifice of cloud seemed cast of concrete. Bright flashes of lightning accompanied by loud thunderclaps made us shiver involuntarily. We felt the pores of our mouths tingle with the stress of anticipation. I passed the jar around with a quiet caution. Sippers only, till we know for sure. This time the dawn did not fail us. Amid tears of gratitude and whelps of joy. A huge deluge of rain fell upon us. Oh, that was so lovely, Nina. So lovely. An hour of wonderful, beautiful, heavy, and beautiful, bountiful time. That's got to be me, this is.
It is.
It's got to be me wrapping this bit.
I think the formula is sometimes, Douglas, where Dougal has one adjective, you have two. So.
Or five.
Or five.
I think I've got 5 in here.
And this deserves it. This deserves it.
It deserves it. That's exactly what I thought.
Yeah.
An hour of wonderful, bountiful, heavy, and beautiful rain. Well, that's 4. We filled the containers, as well as the plastic bag. Robin's privilege. God, he was so happy. Then filled our shrunken stomachs to uncomfortable distension. Well, that was a nice paragraph.
Yeah, we've been waiting. I think I've been waiting for you to read that for a few days now. It's such a relief.
For 3 days.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
What a great paragraph. An hour of wonderful, bountiful, heavy, and beautiful rain. Simple things, Nina. Simple, life-giving things.
Okay. So, yeah, he weeps that day. There were many days when he got very emotional and was sort of really reliving all of this. And I realized, stupid me to have not sort of realized this ahead of time, but I really was talking with someone who had been through a very traumatic experience, with his whole family. So at some point I remember saying to him, Douglas, I'm sorry. I feel like I'm putting you through something like terrible and we don't have to do this. And he said, no. Like, this happened to me. He said, this happened to me, whether I talk about it or not. And actually he said, he thanked me at the end and said, I don't know that I would have gone back and read this book again if it hadn't been for your project. And I think, in that sense, I was reassured that I wasn't torturing him. The project, the exhibition ends with a rope that is significant and figures large on day 38, which is the day of their rescue. So I'll just tell you the story of the rescue and let you hear him sort of make the last comment. On day 7, they see a ship that does not see them, and the ship sails by them, and it's a devastating event. They were so close to this ship that went by that they could read the words on the ship, the name of the ship. And it provokes a kind of important shift of thinking for them all, which I would describe as kind of the shift from waiting for rescue to one of focusing on survival. So rather than waiting for someone to come along and save them, they decide, fuck everybody, we're not counting on anyone else's help. We are going to save ourselves. It's just survival, survival, survival from here on out. Forget about anyone else out there. And they were so entrenched in this mindset. It was so important to kind of not have that heartbreak of a ship not seeing them ever again, that when this fishing boat shows up that in fact does save them, they literally cannot believe what they're seeing. There is just sort of they meet it with utter disbelief and sort of, even as the ship is sort of turning towards them and coming in their direction, Douglas talked about how he couldn't believe it and couldn't allow himself to believe it. And so I asked him at what point he believes it, and he talks about the rope. And that is when he utters the phrase that became the title for this show, to feel something that was not of our world. So I will let you hear his voice, and then we can talk.
We could not believe that we were going to be picked up. We couldn't let ourselves fall into that trap again.
Of course.
That we couldn't believe it. We couldn't believe it. Even when they stopped, we couldn't believe it.
Well, when did you believe it? What happened that made you believe it?
The rope. The rope came across the dinghy.
Right.
And I looked at that rope and I thought, my God, this is it.
Wow, not until then. Not until the rope.
Not until then. I didn't believe. I didn't dare lift my sort of veil of security.
Right.
Until that rope had been made fast.
Wow. Now I'm trying to imagine the feel of that rope in your hand, like when you grabbed it.
Feeling. To feel something that was not us, that was not of our world. It was so good.
All right. So if you have questions, I will try to have answers.